What's up, everyone? Welcome to Back to the Future, the podcast that takes a trip down Philly sports memory lane. I'm your host, Jim Montgomery. Well, it is now June, and if you listen to my other podcast, This Day in Philly Sports History, where we take a daily look at what's happening in the current state of Philly sports, as well as look at what happened that particular day. You know, for the month of May, we did a spotlight on the Sixers' playoff seasons throughout their history in Philadelphia. And the thought process behind that was it was supposed to be a coronation almost, or a celebration of the Sixers finally getting over the hump, getting past the second round, moving to the Eastern Conference Finals, and then hopefully getting over that hump and going to the NBA Finals. Unfortunately, it did not turn into that. So somewhere about halfway through the month, it turned into a group therapy session. Much like when the Eagles lost the Super Bowl, we did the whole mourning period where I dove in and we ripped the Band-Aid off and took a look at all the painful losses in Philly sports history. Here we are with the Sixers, and most of that month just was a horrible reminder of just how shitty the Sixers' history has been, in the sense that they were always so close. They wasted opportunities. There was wasted potential. Unfulfilled expectations, whatever you want to call it. So last week's podcast, we talked about AI and Larry Brown. Once again, you have one of the best players to ever play the game on your team, walk away with it with one trip to the finals. You have a Hall of Fame coach who left the team pretty much in turmoil. Did not get a chance to see the new special on the NBA Network. Hopefully going to watch that tonight, the Everything But the Chip. But basically they highlight that 2000-2001 run that the Sixers were on. We did mention that on the podcast last week. And we know that there's a lot of blame to go around, and we took the dive into that. So if you want to hear more about that and haven't listened to it yet, listen to last week's episode on Allen Iverson and Larry Brown. This week's episode, we're going to kind of continue the mourning process, the group therapy session, if you will. And this will be the end of it. We'll put a bow on the 22-23 Sixers season and then just move on. But I had this plan, and to be honest, we're going to go back a little bit further than the 2000 season, and basically this is what led to the Allen Iverson era, if you will. So we're going to talk about the 86 Sixers offseason, which probably is the worst offseason in their history. I know some of the old heads out there will say the offseason that they traded Will Chamberlain might be worse. I'll leave that up to you guys to debate, but this one could be, if it's not number one, I'm going to say it's 1B. But we'll get more into that in a couple minutes. Like I said, this will put the bow on the 22-23 Sixers season. We'll move on. Sure, we'll still talk about the Sixers a lot on this day in Philly sports history due to Nick Nurse being named the coach, and obviously the draft's coming up, free agency. Is James Harden coming back? Is he not? There were some stories we talked about this morning. So be sure to check out This Day in Philly Sports History, wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. Before we get into the 86 Sixers offseason, though, I'm going to talk to you for a minute about our friends at phillygoat.com. Father's Day is coming up, and I know I've been dropping hints to my wife for a couple weeks now just about a couple of the t-shirts that I wanted from phillygoat.com. They are your one-stop shop for your Philly apparel needs, whether it's sweatshirts, t-shirts, sweatpants, hats. They have beer koozies, stickers, whatever you can think of that's Philly related. They have all the four major teams in the Union covered. They have Philly neighborhoods, Philly-centric things, Rocky. If you listen to This Day in Philly Sports History, I've talked about the Mr. Sandman's Gym shirt, which I'm hoping that I'm getting for Father's Day. There's also, we've been talking about the Sixers, and we're going to talk about the Sixers today, the Allen Iverson with the ear cup to the crowd at the Wells Fargo Center. Definitely worth checking out. They're good quality shirts, too. I wouldn't peddle any crappy stuff on here, and they're comfortable. They're not the heavy duty t-shirts. They're the light ones, like the comfortable material. They have some give in them. I'm a bigger guy. I need that some of the little stretch there. I never put my shirts in the dryer, but they're the good quality shirts that I don't think are going to shrink. So go to phillygoat.com and check it out. Drop some hints to your significant other, your kids, your mom. If you're doing some shopping for your dad, if your dad's a Philly sports fan, good. They have some good old school stuff for there. Also, make sure to tell your dad to listen to the podcast. Tell your grandfather to listen to the podcast. Uncles, whoever. Tell your mom to listen too, for all I care. But phillygoat.com for all your Philly sports apparel needs. Drop the promo code Jim Montgomery for 10% off of your order, or click the link below in the description. That's promo code Jim Montgomery for 10% off at phillygoat.com. I promise you won't be disappointed. All right, back to the 86 offseason. And to kind of set the stage and give you a little bit of background, the 85-86 Sixers finished in the 3rd seed, much like this team did. Lost to the Bucks in the 2nd round. The substitute Celtics for Bucks, just like this team. The difference was they did not have any. Moses Malone did not play in the playoffs for them. He fractured his orbital bone late in the season and did not play in the playoffs. Andrew Toney did not play at all that season, or played 6 games that season due to his foot injury. It was Barkley's 2nd year, though, so he was sort of stepping into his own. With no Moses Malone, he got a ton of playoff experience. He was basically the leading scorer and rebounder for most of their playoff games that year. So going into the 86-87 season, things were high. Our hopes were high, expectations were high. People were feeling good around the Sixers. I mean, Dr. J announced his retirement. It was sort of his farewell tour. So you knew that he was going to retire. So different places he stopped around the league, they did Dr. J appreciation and whatnot. Moses was looking to bounce back. Everybody was excited for Barkley to play with him and just learn from one of the greatest to ever do it. They had similar styles, similar just way they played. So things were looking good. I mean, everybody was hoping that Toney was going to be able to bounce back, which unfortunately we know we'll get more into that. There was some back and forth. Mo Cheeks was on that team, who is a Hall of Famer. Like everything looked good with just the team they had coming back. But did I mention they had 2 first-round picks that year? They had the 1st pick overall and the 21st pick in the draft. So things were looking ridiculously good. And now the reason they had the first pick in the draft was from a trade that happened 7 years before in 1979. The trade with the Clippers that sent Joe Jellybean Bryant, Kobe Bryant's dad, to the Clippers. So the Clippers were just like, yeah, whatever. That's 8 years from now, 7 years from now. We'll give you the pick. Didn't realize they were going to tank, and it turned in to be the number 1 pick. I have a feeling this was a lot before the protected picks and things like that you see now. So going into this offseason, I mean, as a Sixers fan, you have to be like, oh my goodness, this is going to be a great year. And for the most part, there were some good players in that draft where if they were picking in the top 5, let's say, there were definitely some good picks for them to walk away with. However, the consensus overall number 1 pick that year was Brad Daugherty. He was a 7-foot center from North Carolina. And I mean, think about it. You have Moses Malone mentoring Charles Barkley and Brad Daugherty. Think about that front court. I mean, you have Barkley and Daugherty down low. I mean, and the way the NBA was played by then, that had been a formidable team. So you gotta like what you're seeing if you're a Sixers fan. I mean, plus the fact they were only 2 years removed from the conference final. You had Mo Cheeks, who was in his prime, Moses Malone, who was a little bit older but still had some good years left in him. You had Dr. J, who wanted to go out on his terms, so why not? He's going to play his best. I mean, he still was playing at a high level. It was looking good. All right, and moving then into draft day, you had to kind of think that they had to keep pace because the Celtics were the defending champs. They had the second pick. And it's just amazing how teams were trading with these guys. And you had to think that it was a slam dunk for both teams. They were both going to reload, continue the Sixers-Celtics rivalry into the late 80s, early 90s, and just, I mean, had a rivalry from the 60s through the 70s, now the 80s. The rich just keep getting richer, I guess you could say. I mean, Sixers take Daugherty. The consensus then at that point was for the Celtics to take guard Len Bias. I think it was a guard. I'll have to look that up and see. So, I mean, things were just looking good. And then the day of the draft, close to the clock kept ticking. 90 minutes before draft time. And apparently all this was going on behind the scenes. Harold Katz dropped two bombshells on Sixers Nation, Sixers fans everywhere. The first was, remember that first round pick? No. I guess for whatever reason he wasn't sold on Brad Daugherty, or he was very sold on Roy Hinson, but they sent the number 1 pick to the Cavaliers for Roy Hinson and $800,000. Okay. Then, bombshell number 2, traded Moses Malone, Terry Catledge, the number 21 first-round pick, and a second-rounder in 1998 to Washington for Jeff Ruland and Cliff Robinson. Let that sink in for a minute. Imagine this Sixers team right now somehow getting the number 1 pick, trading it for, I don't even know, Kevin Love and $5 million, say, and then trading Joel Embiid, Tobias Harris, a first-round pick and a second-round pick 3 years from now for LeBron James, and maybe not LeBron James is a bad example. I don't even know. Like, it's unfathomable how they could do not one of these trades, but both of these 90 minutes before the draft is going to get started. So the rationale was general manager Pat Williams, who was instrumental in building that championship team in 82-83, said that it was the toughest thing and toughest day of his life, and having to get all that done and make those trades and saying goodbye to Moses, getting rid of this. But it's what head coach Matt Goukas wanted. Problem was, Matt Goukas had only been coaching that team for 1 year. So he inherited Billy Cunningham's team, didn't like it, and then this was his answer. And Pat Williams, I mean, he ended up getting the first round. He ended up being the general manager of the Magic, and I believe he was the one that put together the Penny Hardaway, Shaquille O'Neal team. But you got to be better than that. Your first year head coach, and this is what he's wanting. So you go ahead and mortgage not only the future, but like the long-term future. It's one thing to mortgage the future for a run that it's going to cost you 2 or 3 years and you come back. He sent this team and this organization into a tailspin for almost a decade. Barkley, Mo Cheeks, and Dr. J were absolutely pissed. So much so that in one of his final speech or something when the Sixers were honoring him, Dr. J basically said, take care of Barkley, take care of Moses. Don't do what you did with Moses. Don't do what you did. There was a couple other guys that basically they just kind of sent packing unceremoniously and probably earlier than what they should have for money reasons. He was like, don't treat your team like that, and basically sent a warning out to the league that, like, hey, this is not necessarily a place where you want to come if you're a free agent. He wasn't wrong. And we'll see more about that in a little bit. But Moses obviously was pissed because Harold Katz didn't even call him to let him know he was traded. That's the fucked up part. Didn't even call him. Had one of his assistant general managers or somebody do that for him. And I do know it was something that throughout his career, Charles Barkley was pissed off and wasn't a huge Harold Katz fan. I think they eventually did make up because he was one of the guys that Barkley talked about when his number was retired. But, I mean, at this point, Sixers fans were like, what is going on? I mean, think about that. You went from having high hopes of having Brad Daugherty on a team with Moses Malone, Mo Cheeks, Dr. J. You were hoping that Andrew Toney could get his foot healthy. And you had another first-round pick just in case that you could bring in another guard. And now you have Roy Hinson, Jeff Ruland, and Cliff Robinson. So how we all know, obviously, it didn't work out well, but let's just break down each part of this trade, though. Roy Hinson spent a season and a half in Philly, ended up being traded to the Nets. Jeff Ruland, he was injury prone. He was injured like twice before the Sixers even got him. Hurt his knee 5 games into the next season, retired. Tried to come back in 1991 for a couple games, got hurt again. But that's it. Like Jeff Ruland. And you could have had Brad Daugherty and Moses Malone. But no, Roy Hinson, who was gone after a year and a half. Jeff Ruland, who was gone after 5 games. Now, Jeff Ruland did have a solid coaching career at Iona. I'll give him that. But that does nothing to help the Sixers out. Cliff Robinson, solid. He spent 3 seasons in Philly. 16 points per game. Unfortunately, I know what you're all thinking. We got Cliff Robinson, not Clifford Robinson. Rest in peace, Clifford. Clifford Robinson was the better one. We got Cliff, not Clifford. We got Cliff. It's kind of like one of those State Farm commercials with Chris Paul. We got the State Farm agent, not the basketball player. How'd that number 21 pick pan out? Washington used it to pick Anthony Jones. He spent 3 years in the league. Not a huge loss in that sense. However, taken around, or not long after that, you had guys like Arvydas Sabonis, Kevin Duckworth, Mark Price, Dennis Rodman, Nate McMillan. All of those guys could have been had with that 21 pick. But you got Roy Hinson and Jeff Ruland for him. And Cliff. Not Clifford. You got Cliff. You didn't even get the right Robinson. You got Cliff, not Clifford. Moses Malone, who at the time Katz thought he was pretty much shot. And, I mean, it was a fractured orbital bone. It wasn't even like he had a torn ACL or anything. Just you give the bone time to heal, you're back. He played 9 more seasons. 9. Had 3 more All-Star games, and just would have been a great mentor for Brad Daugherty and Charles Barkley. But, he's washed up. He has nothing more. 9 more seasons. I mean, Brad Daugherty, we all know how that worked out. I mean, he was a 5-time All-Star, 19 points a game, 9.5 rebounds per game. He was an integral part of that Cavs team in the late 80s, early 90s. Played 8 seasons, had a back injury. But would he have maybe not have suffered the back injury if he was playing with Moses Malone and Charles Barkley? You never know, but, I mean, either way, you put him on this team for 8 seasons. You have 8 seasons of him and Barkley in your backcourt, or your front court. That's a pretty formidable team. And then you have the flexibility and maneuverability then to draft some guys and bring some guys in, because guys are going to want to play with that the way the NBA was at this time. But no, we want it. Roy Hinson and Jeff Ruland and Cliff. Not Clifford. Cliff. So, obviously, Dr. J ended up retired. Mo Cheeks spent 3 more seasons in Philly, then bounced around for a couple years before getting into coaching. Andrew Toney had 2 more injury seasons before his retirement. But there is a lot of speculation about the front office giving him shit about the injury, not believing it was as injured as it was, and maybe if he had properly been treated or rehabbed for it, he could have had a longer career. Kind of never know. I do have some things lined up to take a deeper dive into that. Charles spent 6 more seasons in Philly before finally forcing a trade to Phoenix, basically because they were giving him a bunch of stiffs. Never achieved the success team-wise that he did in those first 2 years he was in Philly. There was 1 year they were the 1 seed, but I think that was fool's gold. I mean, obviously, all the personal accolades and the stats and everything he had, but it's just a shame to just waste so much of that time for no reason. I mean, what could have been? I mean, think about this starting lineup for 1986-87. You got Moses Malone, Charles Barkley, Brad Daugherty, Dr. J, Mo Cheeks. Imagine if they'd taken Dennis Rodman with that second pick. I'll give you a second to think about that. That's who mock drafts, yeah, they did them back then. Mock drafts had the Sixers take quite a few of them, because I did my research on this and looked around. Quite a few mock drafts had the Sixers taking Dennis Rodman with that 21st pick in the first round. So now all of a sudden you got Brad Daugherty, Dennis Rodman, Charles Barkley, Moses Malone, Mo Cheeks. Come on now. I mean, I'm thinking about the notes, and I'm looking at the notes I jotted down that maybe they couldn't compete with the Bulls. I don't know, man. Like Michael Jordan had trouble with the Pistons with guys like Dennis Rodman, Bill Laimbeer. I mean, think about those three dudes. And Michael Jordan trying to, like, it could have. I mean, they certainly could have competed with the Celtics and Pistons. I mean, Jordan, I'm a Jordan GOAT truther, but you have those guys on the team. I mean, he played well against all of those guys individually, but you put Daugherty, Barkley, and Rodman on the same team, who's beating the Sixers? Tell me who's beating them. I'll wait, because there is nobody. But we chose Roy Hansen, Jeff Rowland, Cliff, not Clifford, Robinson instead. Oh, and don't forget the $800,000. Fuck. So it just got worse from there. But slowly, the bad drafts, and they ended up having to pay the piper for some of the trades, so they had lack of draft picks. The Sixers went from one of the elite teams in the league. It was throughout the late 70s, early 80s. It was the Sixers, Celtics, and Lakers. I mean, probably you had the Lakers, Celtics were here, tier 1, but like the Sixers were tier 1A. Like they were, you had those two teams and then the Sixers and then everybody else. But due to the snowball effect and the chain of events that happened from here, it's disappointing. And it would be a long journey back. I mentioned last week's episode that it took the Sixers to get Allen Iverson and trying to fit guys in there. Well, part of the reason they didn't have anybody, part of the reason they were able to get Allen Iverson is because of this shit that took place. And in case you're wondering, the Celtics did draft Len Bias, who was supposed to be the heir apparent then to Larry Bird and lead the team. Unfortunately, he died a couple days later of a cocaine overdose. Apparently, he was at a party celebrating getting drafted. So the Celtics did go into a little bit of a spiral there too. Didn't take them nearly as long to get out of it as the Sixers because of just the ineptitude of the guys that Harold Katz put in place. I mean, there's no other way to put it. I mean, think about what you could have had. You could have had Moses Malone, Charles Barkley, Brad Daugherty, Dr. J, Mo Cheeks as your starting lineup that year. I mean, the Pistons went to the championship out of the East that year, lost to the Lakers, but maybe Dr. J rides out on top one last ride. The Lakers were getting a little bit older at the time. I mean, they still had another championship or two in them, but I don't know, man. Hands down to me, the worst day in Sixers draft history. I mean, and I looked. There's nothing even close. I mean, you could Sean Bradley, he's like a Hall of Famer compared to this day. I would even say it could be the worst day in Sixers offseason history. And again, some of the old heads out there that are listening, I know I got a couple uncles that listen who are big Wilt fans. Let me know, was this the impact it had on the team? Was these two trades because they happened on the same day within 90, or it was announced 90 minutes before the draft. Was this worse than Wilt? I think it has to be, because the Sixers had a slam dunk and they missed it. There was nobody around. They were on a fast break slam dunk and they missed it. It's frustrating. It's very frustrating. But let me know what you think. I mean, am I over exaggerating this, or is this hands down the worst day in Sixers history? Next week on the podcast, take a look at kind of an interesting one for me. We're going to take a look at William Cox, who used to own the Phillies, who was kind of a forgotten person in the terms of gambling scandals. You had the Black Sox early in the 1900s with Shoeless Joe Jackson. Obviously, there's Pete Rose, but William Cox was in there, and it's kind of a little shady that led to some things that would ultimately lead to the Phillies winning the World Series in 1980. So be sure to tune into that next week. Like and subscribe to this podcast. Tell somebody, tell your friends, spread the word. Tell one person, have them tell one person. Let's grow this thing. I've mentioned it a lot. Now that summer's here, we're trying to grow, and we've got some things planned up. Check out This Day in Philly Sports History. For June, we're doing it's rivalry month, so we're taking a look at Philly's biggest rivals for all sports and some of the colleges as well. Go to phillygoat.com. Use the promo code Jim Montgomery for all your Father's Day needs. Check me out on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, Jimbo_Mont. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, Instagram at Philly Jimbo. We've finally done it. We've put a bow on the 22-23 Sixers season. It's on to bigger and better things. I mentioned before, always forward, never straight. Let's see where Nick Nurse and this offseason takes us. One thing's for sure, it's going to be hard-pressed to have a shittier offseason than what the Sixers had in 1986. This has been Back to the Future. I'm Jim Montgomery. Go have yourselves a week, and until next time, I'll see you when I see you.